Florida tipped 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico. What grew back left researchers completely speechless. These weren't carefully positioned materials following some detailed engineering blueprint. They were kitchen leftovers. Shells pulled off steam pots and swept out of processing plants, loaded onto barges, and dumped overboard into Gulf waters along the Florida coastline somewhere between 2007 and 2024. Nobody expected anything worth getting excited about. Environmental critics called it ocean dumping, with a conservation sticker plastered over the top. Commercial fishermen who had worked those same waters across generations warned it would finish off whatever little was left of Florida's already battered coastal floor. Even the scientists who put the program together figured they might be watching over an expensive mistake in the making. But something started happening on that Gulf sea floor that went against every single prediction, every timeline, and every assumption people held about how quickly nature is capable of bouncing back. A stretch of dead ocean bottom started coming alive. Not slowly, not after years of patient observation, faster, denser, and more structurally layered than anything any model had suggested could happen. What took shape down there wasn't just a reef, it was a full living system, and it's still growing to this day. Here's exactly how it unfolded, and why it's going to reshape the way you think about the ocean entirely. The experiment nobody believed would work. Between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission carried out one of the most disputed coastal experiments in the state's entire history. The concept sounds almost too straightforward to be taken seriously. Gather discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities spread across Florida, truck them to the coastline, load them onto barges, and drop them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key, more than 500,000 tons of the stuff. The backlash arrived immediately, and it came from more than one direction. Environmental groups branded it a disposal operation dressed up to look like conservation work. They argued those shells would suffocate whatever fragile biological communities were still hanging on across the soft, sandy seafloor underneath. Coastal fishermen who had devoted entire lifetimes to reading those waters, families who knew every current and every seasonal shift, feared sediment disruption, collapsed fish habitats, and lasting damage to the fishing grounds their whole livelihoods relied on. The opposition wasn't fringe. It was organized, credible, and rooted in genuine ecological concern from people who understood these waters at a deep level. And still, the commission pressed ahead. Their reasoning was straightforward. Those shells were headed to landfills no matter what. If there was any real chance they could serve as a foundation for a damaged reef system, running the experiment was worth absorbing the political heat. Here's the piece that most accounts tend to skip over. Nobody. Not the program's designers, not the marine biologists reviewing the proposal, not the fisheries managers who put their names on the approval, actually believed things would move this fast. When the first monitoring teams went back out to the deposition sites 18 months after those initial shell drops, they were prepared for the data to back up everything the skeptics had been saying all along. What they found instead stopped Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, right in the middle of a sentence during a team debrief. Life was taking hold across the shell mounds, not 2 years in, not 3 years in, which is the accepted minimum window for any measurable biological response from an artificial reef project. Within months, clusters of marine organisms were forming at rates that had no comparison anywhere in the existing body of scientific literature. The shells weren't acting like passive rubble resting on the ocean floor. They were operating as biological triggers, jump-starting processes that the surrounding environment had no natural way to begin on its own, and nobody could completely explain why it was all happening so quickly. To find that answer, you had to examine something so tiny it was practically invisible without magnification. What was taking place down there was stranger than anyone had expected. The invisible phase. Tiny organisms that reconstructed an entire ecosystem. The first colonizers weren't fish. They weren't oysters. They weren't anything you could spot from the deck of a research vessel. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells settling onto the seafloor, microscopic bacterial communities began spreading across the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms, structured living carpets that convert an inert shell into a functioning microhabitat. These weren't random clusters of microorganisms scattered about. They were organized biological infrastructure, laying down a foundation that everything else would eventually build upon, and the shells themselves were doing something nobody had fully seen coming. Oyster shells are made up primarily of aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate that gradually dissolves when submerged in seawater. As those shells began releasing calcium ions into the water around them, they produced tiny localized alkaline zones, microscopic chemical environments embedded within the broader Gulf chemistry. Those localized shifts in chemistry were precisely what calcifying organisms need in order to attach and start growing. Barnacles, tube worms, juvenile oysters, creatures that require a very specific chemical signal before they'll commit to settling on a surface. The shells were producing that signal. They weren't simply offering physical structure. They were actively engineering the conditions for their own colonization. Weeks afterward, diatoms and microalgae moved into those established biofilms, laying down the base layer of a rudimentary food web. Microscopic crustaceans and larval mollusks followed close behind, feeding on the algae. Those grazers then attracted the first juvenile fish. Each biological stage fed directly into the one after it, a self-reinforcing cycle assembling itself invisibly out of discarded seafood scraps on the dark floor of the Gulf. Here's why that matters at a fundamental level. Sandy seabeds simply cannot do this. Sand provides no attachment surface for biofilm formation, no chemical microzones, no structural complexity whatsoever. Florida's soft-bottom Gulf floor had been biologically trapped in a kind of ecological dead end for years. The shells bypassed that dead end completely. By the close of the first 6 months, the shell surfaces were coated in biofilm and microalgae. To anyone observing from above, or even diving the sites directly, they looked like a disappointment. A heap of old shells sitting on a flat seafloor, slowly turning gray. But the water samples and sediment cores collected by Dr. Krimsky told an entirely different story. In less time than most conventional artificial reef projects show any measurable biological response at all, the shell deposits had built a complete and functioning microscopic ecosystem. The invisible phase was the hidden scaffolding. Without the bacteria, without the aragonite chemistry, without the biofilm nourishing that first wave of grazers, there is no reef. There is only calcium sitting on sand. That scaffolding was already firmly in place, and what followed made the scientists begin questioning everything they believed they understood about how reefs actually form. The return of the reef builders. Oysters depend on hard surfaces to survive. That single biological constraint had been quietly choking Florida's Gulf Coast for decades, and most people had no idea it was even happening. Oyster larvae, known as spat, drift along with the current, hunting for something solid to attach to. In a healthy reef environment, that solid surface is the built-up shell mass left behind by previous generations. Centuries worth of dead oysters stacked into a dense, layered platform that filters water, cushions erosion, and provides habitat for an estimated 300 distinct species. But Florida's natural reef systems had been hollowed out. Overharvesting, pollution, coastal development, and the runoff that followed had steadily torn apart a reef network that once blanketed hundreds of square miles of Gulf floor. By the early 2000s, spat were drifting through open water with almost nowhere to land. No surface, no settlement, no new oysters. The reproductive cycle had simply collapsed. The Gulf had no built-in way to fix itself. The deposited shells addressed that bottleneck almost right away. Each shell mound became a concentrated landing zone, placed sometimes deliberately, sometimes by the logic of Gulf currents, exactly along the paths drifting spat would travel. Within the first year, Dr. Bill Pine, a marine researcher at the University of Florida Marine Lab, documented juvenile oysters attaching to the deposited shells in numbers that significantly outpaced what the program had projected. The larvae were finding surfaces to grip. They were settling. They were starting to grow. By the second year, those juveniles had matured into reproductive adults. They were producing larvae of their own. That second generation settled onto the existing reef structure and pushed it outward. Human hands had built the starting conditions. After that, nature took over entirely. Here's what the data actually showed. By year 3, monitoring surveys recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shell. Nearby, soft bottom areas with no substrate supported virtually none at all. The reefs weren't confined to the original footprint of the shell drops anymore either. Oysters were dying naturally, adding their own shells to the growing structure, and in doing so, providing new surfaces for the next wave of larvae. Vertical growth, horizontal spread. The reef was essentially building itself. And then came the moment that shifted the entire public conversation around the program. Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been among the loudest and most persistent opponents of the shell deposition effort from the start. He had spoken against it before state bodies. He had publicly warned that it would wreck the fishing grounds his family had worked across 3 generations. In 2013, standing at the rail of his boat above one of the established reef sites, Lenz watched a dense school of redfish holding in the current around a shell mound. He said something he hadn't intended to say. He said he was wrong. He'd never seen fish stack up that way in 25 years on that water. That reversal wasn't simply one man rethinking his position. It was the moment the scientific findings and the lived experience of people who had fished those waters their whole lives finally came into alignment. And the fish were only the beginning of what these reefs were about to accomplish. When the fish arrived, everything shifted. Reef fish don't wait around for formal invitations. The instant structural complexity shows up on a flat, featureless seafloor, they find it. They located these reefs within 2 years of the Cedar Key sites establishing themselves. Fish surveys were coming back with numbers that prompted Dr. Pine's team to go back and double-check their entire methodology. Biomass around the reef sites had climbed by more than 340%. Compared to control areas of similar size, species diversity was up 240%. Here's the detail that sets this apart from a standard aggregation effect. These weren't fish that had simply relocated from somewhere else in the Gulf, drawn in by a new underwater landmark. The main contributor to the growth was juvenile fish, creatures born right there in those waters and making it all the way to adulthood. The reefs weren't simply drawing in a population that already existed elsewhere. They were generating life that those waters had never held before. Redfish showed up first, navigating the intricate shell formations to feed and escape predators. Sheep's head came next, flourishing on the invertebrate communities that had colonized every hard surface. Flounder patrolled the reef edges. Snook appeared in numbers nobody had recorded in those waters for years. And Mike Lenz wasn't the only captain who turned his boat around. Charter operators throughout the Cedar Key region started formally petitioning for new reef installations near their most productive fishing spots, from the very same commission they had taken to court 6 years before. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants all reported measurable bumps in revenue tied directly to the marine activity around the reef sites. The ecological ripple effect kept climbing the food chain. Octopuses staked out territories in the reef's tangled gaps and overhangs. Sea turtles came back and began grazing on the invertebrate communities blanketing the shells. Dolphins were spotted hunting in organized patterns along reef edges, working the dense fish concentrations in coordinated sweeps. Every new species to arrive reinforced the trophic structure beneath it. The system was growing more complex, more stable, and biologically stronger with every season that passed. What made this ecologically meaningful rather than just visually striking was a distinction that Dr. Pine's team took great care to establish in the published research. Artificial reefs built from concrete or sunken vessels have traditionally been effective at concentrating fish that already inhabit an area, essentially reshuffling an existing population around a new underwater landmark. That can generate impressive survey numbers without representing any genuine rise in total marine life. You're relocating fish, not producing them. The Cedar Key reefs were doing something fundamentally different. Juvenile fish counts were the leading driver of the biomass growth. These reefs were manufacturing fish, creating the survival conditions that had simply not existed in that ecosystem before. That distinction carried enormous weight for how Florida's fisheries managers approached the idea of expanding the program. But fish were only part of the story. Something else was shifting in the water itself. Something no model had anticipated. Something whose consequences stretched far beyond the reef's physical footprint. Consider the billion-gallon machines quietly at work. A single mature oyster filters somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every single day. Multiply that figure across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving across the restored reef sites. Entire reef systems were pushing billions of gallons of Gulf water through their bodies daily, stripping out suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff. No machinery, no electrical infrastructure, no maintenance costs. Nature had assembled an industrial-scale water treatment operation entirely out of discarded restaurant waste. The Gulf Coast has carried a chronic nutrient pollution problem that has defined its degraded condition for decades. Nitrogen and phosphorus flowing in from agricultural operations and urban development pour steadily into coastal waters, feeding harmful algal blooms that cloud the water column, suffocate marine life, and periodically set off mass fish die-offs. The oyster reefs were striking at that problem right at its biological source. Water clarity around the reef sites began improving in measurable ways within just a few years. Dissolved oxygen levels climbed, nutrient concentrations dropped, and those improvements weren't staying contained to the immediate area. They were expanding outward in an ever-widening radius around every site. Cleaner water allows sunlight to penetrate further down. Seagrass, which provides essential habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, depends on that light to live. As the reefs cleaned up the water, seagrass crept back into zones too murky to sustain it for many years. Then a second feedback loop kicked in. Seagrass locked down sediment, cut turbidity even further, and allowed more seagrass to take hold. Two self-reinforcing cycles, pushing improvements well beyond anything the shell deposits had directly affected. Researchers calculated that the filtration services produced between 2007 and 2024 were worth tens of millions of dollars in ecological terms. Nature was handing it over at no cost. The findings didn't remain confined to Florida. Alabama had launched its own shell recycling effort by 2015. Mississippi came next. Louisiana kicked off large-scale reef construction initiatives. The Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor adopted the approach in one of the most severely degraded urban waterways across North America. Circular environmental design, taking waste materials and repurposing them as functional ecological infrastructure, was transforming conservation engineering on a global scale. Coastal engineers in Canada, Australia, and Europe started examining the Cedar Key outcomes closely, but one test still lay ahead that nobody had planned for, one that would show up without any warning at all. September 2017, Hurricane Irma, Category 4, wind speeds topping 150 miles per hour. Devastating storm surge, waves carrying enough energy to strip beaches bare and completely reshape shorelines within hours. When damage assessors moved through the affected area after Irma had passed, they encountered something that stopped every conversation immediately. Shorelines backed by the restored reefs had suffered dramatically less erosion, somewhere between 30 and 40% less compared to neighboring soft sand beaches. Their dense, irregular, three-dimensional structure absorbed and broke apart wave energy before it could hit the shore at full strength. Just friction and interrupted momentum had protected the land. Engineers calculated that the reefs had prevented roughly $3 million in coastal property damage during Irma alone. The total expense of the entire 15-year program had come to approximately $5 million. The reefs had very nearly paid for themselves through a single storm. Seawalls crack, riprap shifts around, steel corrodes, concrete eventually gives out. Oyster reefs, on the other hand, repair themselves. Storm damage prompts new larval settlement. Every successive generation adds both height and structural complexity. The barrier was becoming more resilient after each storm, not less. Conventional shoreline armoring costs hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per mile. The Cedar Key program achieved comparable levels of protection at a small fraction of that price and kept getting better year after year without any further investment. And the most remarkable part was still playing out. By the early 2020s, the reefs had grown considerably beyond their original footprint entirely on their own, with no human involvement whatsoever. The oldest sites had roughly doubled in total area, driven by the oyster reproductive cycle. Each generation settled, matured, died, and left behind shell for the following larval wave: vertical buildup, horizontal expansion. The reef was engineering its own growth on a timeline that no human planner had ever set. The earliest deposits were nothing more than irregular mounds of loose calcium carbonate. The living reefs that developed from them were architecturally intricate. Vertical profiles, sheltered passages, overhangs, and dozens of separate microhabitats. Crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish, all exploiting different structural features simultaneously within a single reef section. Not simply sharing a substrate, but genuinely inhabiting a complete ecosystem. Dense oyster reefs also lock away organic carbon inside their shells and in the sediments around them, capturing greenhouse gases that would otherwise drive ocean acidification and heat up the atmosphere. Almost without anyone planning it, the environmental argument had grown into a climate argument as well. Biodiversity measurements at the most established Cedar Key locations were closing in on figures recorded at undisturbed natural limestone reef systems. Sea turtles listed as endangered had come back. Dolphins were working the reef edges in deliberate, methodical passes. The Gulf was reorganizing itself around the oysters, and the oysters were reorganizing themselves around the Gulf. Every oyster that lived and died left behind material for the generation that followed. Each new generation pushed the footprint outward, strained more water, shielded more coastline, and sustained more species. The human intervention had concluded. The ecosystem had not. Projections suggested the process would continue for decades, possibly centuries. 500,000 tons of oyster shells thrown out, written off, dumped into the Gulf with no guarantee that anything worthwhile would come of it. Bacteria moved in within days. The chemistry of the water was reshaped by organite compounds. Biofilm nourished the earliest grazers. Juvenile oysters located surfaces and attached themselves. Generation after generation pushed the structure outward, needing no instruction to do so. Fish showed up, then turtles, then dolphins, running coordinated sweeps along the edges. Water clarity got better. Seagrass crept back into areas it had been absent from for years. A Category 4 hurricane put the reefs to the test, and they held, then came back even sturdier from the stress. The intervention stopped. The ecosystem carried right on building. Should every degraded stretch of coastline on the planet be running this same experiment? Or is the Gulf on the verge of exposing limitations that no one has yet encountered? Hit subscribe and pull up the next video on your screen, because where oyster restoration is heading next is even more remarkable than everything you have just watched.